This channel is for educational purposes only. Please do your own due diligence before making any investment decisions.
This is Joe Rabil. I'm going to give you a stock market update. We're going to go through the key levels. We're going to look at momentum and really what is taking place with this breakout, and what to watch for over the next week, which I think is actually going to be a pretty important week. All right, let's go ahead and get going. If you have any questions, or I should say, if you want to learn a little bit more about some of these techniques, especially in multiple time frame trading using MACD and ADX, I would suggest starting with the book. Also, if you enjoyed the content, please hit that like button and also subscribe. Okay, let's start out with the sentiment, which has shown a drop this week. There were fewer bulls. We had, just kind of dissipated a little bit off the move that it had been making. So I'm putting that flat in the middle, neutral at this point. All right. What I'll say, though, is that I think if we got something decisive to the upside, then I think these guys are going to jump. I think we're going to get more bulls. That seems to be what's been taking place when we see price action in either direction. It seems like the bull-bear spread is following the market. It's just it's just going in the direction of the market. So when it drops, there are more bears, there's less bulls, and when it goes up, there's more bulls and less bears. They're not fighting it. All right. So that's kind of the market where people don't have a high conviction rate, it seems like. But if we got something decisive to the upside, I do think this would move this into a negative position. And if you look at the overbought oversold oscillator, the RSI 5 on the weekly chart, it's already at 71%, and it is in the negative camp for me. Now, to add to that, we're making a lower high while price is making a higher high. And we're doing that on both the 20 RSI in red and the 5 RSI in gray. And so it's a kind of a double whammy there. Now, the thing is that just because we're showing divergence, it's just potential divergence. What we need is actual confirmation with price. And we don't want to jump the gun. And the reason is that if we see follow through, then these two lines are going to go ahead and confirm, and then it'll never have looked like, if you go back and look at it historically, you'd be like, oh, well, there was never any divergence there. But in reality, there was potential divergence. So you need to know that, otherwise you'll take a lot of bad trades using divergence. So just understand we're looking for some sign. Now, what I would suggest, in fact, let me do this first before I go into that. Let me just run through these real quick. The weekly and the daily are still split when it comes to volatility. We've got positive volatility condition in place for the daily, and we have a negative volatility in place for the weekly. And I'll explain that in a second. In terms of the trend, all the time frames, including the hourly, are all in uptrends. On a momentum basis, it's a little split. We've got a solid trend of momentum on the monthly. The weekly it still qualifies as positive, but I'll show you why it's a little less than what I would consider to be convincing. And then the daily is split between MACD and the ADX. All right, let's go ahead and start going through this. Now, the point I wanted to make, and let me just zero in on this for a second, we've got a breakout like right here. And if you notice the way it took place, the breakout bar created a tail at the top, right? I mean, it's not really what we want to see. We want to see a convincing bar. You see the closes here, even this one, even though it's not that big. You see how it's closing near the high of the bar? It's more of a convincing sign. We want to see bars like that. But since this action, we have a lot of those prior to the breakout, but since the breakout, we've gotten a couple tails, and this was a narrow range bar the week after the breakout. And then if you notice what's taking place on the drops, we're finding support. You see how there's no consensus right now. The bulls and the bears are just not giving. It's not like one side or the other has real strong command at this point. Now, that can change instantly on the daily chart, not on the weekly. The weekly needs a little bit more work, but on a daily, if we got one significant strong bar, that DI is going to show confirmation. I'm going to show that in a second. Let me go through the volatility, and then we'll switch to the individual time frames. So we've got this situation where we have high volatility on the weekly chart and low declining volatility on the daily. The way I look at this is you can trade off the weekly chart, but because this is rising on the weekly, you got to be a little bit more selective. You got to be a little bit more careful. You might even want to be playing a little bit smaller size, but you definitely want to try and be a little bit more aggressive taking targets, especially if you take a trade off the weekly chart, meaning if the trigger is on the weekly chart, you need to be a lot more aggressive with your approach at taking profits, I think, if you're going to do that. Until this starts to dissipate to a level where this has dropped down and this is rolled over. If we have that in both time frames, then we can be a lot more comfortable with putting trades on without being, looking, feeling a little nervous, feeling like we're putting on a little bit more risk than we should be. So I just found that when risk is up, like it was through this period, I used to do this where I would just ignore the volatility and I would try and put on trades that would look really, really good, not a lot better than the market. And I kept finding that my stop out rate was a lot higher when the volatility was up and the market wasn't doing all that well. And obviously the market's having an effect on that, but I think it's having a greater effect on the volatility of your positions. It's just an increased risk of being stopped out. And then I noticed a lot of times that I'd be right, but I couldn't stay in the trade. It would get stopped out in high volatility conditions. So you got to be a little bit more careful when we're in this type of environment. All right, let's switch over and start looking at the individual time frames. So, in terms of the monthly, we have been trending. I mean, look, and I did a show with David Keller this week. We did a podcast, and I think it was about 20, 25 minutes where he was just asking me questions, and I went through a lot of detail on different things. One of the things I talked about was this concept that I have taught, which is the trend year. It's something I adapted from my day trading days, and I found it to be very useful even on a yearly chart. And I'll go through this a little bit more detail on another one of these Friday videos. But for now, just suffice to say, we open the year at the low bar. The low bar of the year is the first week of the year was the low of the year, and we've pretty much been trending. So I think if we can make it through October, there's a pretty high probability we're going to close at the high. Open at the low, right? Close at the high. That's a trend year. Kind of what the bar would look like is something like that. That's a trend year. Okay. Now there are what follows in the first half of the next year is pretty important. So we want to recognize this, but we also want to recognize that if you have a stock that has been trending all year and opened at the low and has been trending all year, there's a pretty good chance that it could finish off the year on an up note and maybe finish near its high. So we want to be aware of that. So right now, we're not seeing any real signs of sellers yet, but in October is really important. Again, I go into detail in the interview with Dave, so it might be worth a look at that. All right, so let's look at the weekly chart because we've got this move that I just described where we broke out and it just kind of fizzled. It hasn't really had the follow through, but it hasn't broken down either, right? We see the buyers underneath. We don't see enough buyers to cause this to break out. And what I'm looking at from a momentum standpoint is this peak here corresponds to this peak in green DI, all right? And then this peak here corresponds to this peak here. And now we're at another new high up here and we're making a lower peak. So these two, this is a drop in the DI, but this was a double top. Now we've actually made a higher high in price and we're making a lower high in the DI. So you could really call this a couple of layers of divergence from the DI. We need this to break out to the upside. All right. Now, if you notice during this period, we haven't had an abnormal volume week yet. Okay, haven't had one bar where the volume exceeds. There's a very high correlation to DI, the top DI, and volume. When volume is stronger, it'll cause that DI to move. All right. So we want to just kind of keep an eye out for that. Now, I've got this on the positive camp because there are no sellers. The sellers aren't strong enough to take over. We still have this bias leading up to this move. Okay. And we're operating off of a reverse divergence on the MACD. So I'm still putting it in the positive camp, but I am watching this really like a hawk. If we come down through these 2-3 bars prior, I think there's a lot of risk, not a lot of risk, a higher probability that we're going to spend some time consolidating in the near term. All right, let's look at the daily, because this is sort of like a short-term version of what we're talking about. I mean, MACD doesn't look horrible. In fact, if you look at where it took place, it pulled back, rallied up, came back and tested, and now has turned back to the upside. Well, that's what we expect when we see this this rolling down through. This is right out of my course. I explain this in detail, what I look for, how this works. All right, so it's not surprising to see this doing what it's doing, even though this rolled to the downside. Now, what I don't like is the fact that the green DI really couldn't break out, and we haven't really been able to get a clear higher high in the DI line. We need the DI line to break out. The sellers are not strong. We can see that the sellers have actually weakened here. So that's encouraging, but this will change on a dime. I'm telling you, if you got one big red bar, this will pop. If you get one big green bar that really has some DI to it, then this will break out. We haven't been able to do it yet. It's been very quiet price action. Again, we're going to have another jobs number. It just comes at a regular basis, so we need to be prepared. And by the time you're watching this, it's possible it's already had an effect on these. Now, what I do is I'm not going to give you another update during the day tomorrow. Okay, you have to understand. I'm giving you what is taking place, and I'm framing it out. I'm telling you, if there's a big green bar, if we open on a gap and it fizzles and kind of turns it down, then we're kind of in the same boat. If it opens and has force to the upside, then we're starting something that could be pretty meaningful because we're getting a more convincing breakout taking place. If we open and just gap down, or we actually open and gap down and we have follow through to the downside and we re-enter this breakout area, then you got to start thinking about this as being sort of like a failed breakout, and this will never have confirmed, and we've got a little bit more risk. Now, the good news is that the hourly chart does look pretty good. The problem is look at the momentum. We don't really have any momentum to speak of. We had a little bit going here, didn't really follow through, and then it turned back up. We haven't shown any real strength. Yes, the buyers are back in command, but they're not in command to a level that has us convinced we'll see follow through. Remember, the bulls are in command based on the DI being above 25 like that and being above the prior red peak. But we don't have trend strength unless this blue line is above 25 and confirming new highs like that. Okay, so we don't have that yet. It could happen. It can happen. It's very possible. If we get some strength, we'll see that. But we need to be aware right now. We got to stay on our toes, stay really fluid. All right, let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.